All right, let's continue our conversation about Stoicism, and this, I think, is the final part in a series of videos that was asked. Someone asked me to talk about these topics. So we've now talked about grief and sort of a Stoic approach to grief. We've talked about a Stoic approach to change. The final topic that person suggested was a Stoic approach to fear. And fear is a very important topic, and I want to emphasize before I start now, I'm not talking today about phobias. People can have phobias, and that is actual pathological behavior. A phobia can be incredibly overwhelming, and I'm not talking about those kinds of situations. So, for example, I don't like spiders. I really don't like spiders, but I don't faint when I see a spider. Someone who has an actual spider phobia might faint when they see a spider, or run out of a room screaming. I'm not making fun of it. I'm just saying this is realistic behavior. I don't have that. I just really don't like spiders. So I'm not talking about this type of phobic behavior, because that is something that requires professional treatment, and that's not a matter of, oh, just reason your way out of it and you'll be fine. It's not like that. Okay, so I just want to make that proviso. Having said that, let's talk about fear. Fear is a very natural response. Many animals show fear, and fear is very helpful because fear warns us that something is wrong. Fear warns us that something is dangerous. Think about, you look over an edge when you're walking in the mountains, and you see a massive drop. That makes you typically move back a bit. That's a bit of fear. That's very helpful because it shows you maybe don't walk so close to this edge. The same thing happens, in more modern times. Walking through a dark part of town at night may make you feel something. It just makes you be very careful, makes you be very aware of the situation. So fear in itself can be, let me put it that way, a very helpful warning signal that tells you that it's time to pay attention, right? And in itself, that's good. But I feel often that our brains have evolved to a point where we can start to become very frightened of things and very fearful of things that are not necessarily worth being very afraid of. There is one of the classic Stoics, and I wonder if it was Epictetus, but he said something along the lines of, look at an animal. When an animal is afraid because something bad happens, for example, a predator appears, the animal will be afraid, the animal will flee. But once the animal is safe again, the fear is gone. But in humans, that works very differently, doesn't it? We can be afraid in anticipation. Something hasn't even happened yet, and we're already afraid of it. Or something did happen, and again, I'm not talking about anything traumatic or super bad, but I mean something that startled you, and half an hour later you can still feel that fear when you think back to it. And that, I think, is where our very advanced brains, right? The very advanced brains that we have evolved to have, can kind of get in the way of us being relaxed and being okay. So one of our habits, I think, is that we tend to overthink things. We tend to, some people more than others, but we're quite prone to really considering every possible angle of a specific situation, especially if we have to make a difficult decision. Will I not accept this job? If I accept it, I have to move. If I move, I will lose my friends, maybe. These kinds of things, right? But even worse than that, because at least that's a concrete situation, I think, is when we find ourselves in situations where we worry considerably about what may happen. Like, well, I'm going to have this conversation with this or that person. I may not like what I have to say, and they will get angry, and they'll do this, that, and the other. But none of that's actually said. It's not necessarily the case that person will get angry. So one of the very important lessons from the Stoics, and this is Seneca, I've always liked this way of stating it very much, is don't take an advance on future suffering. Well, if you continuously live in that state of, well, I could lose my job, I could be in an accident, I could lose my friends, then you'd live in this continuous state of fear. But the worst thing is, the things that you fear may happen have not even happened. In fact, they may not happen at all. They might. Tomorrow, you may go to work and you may hear that you are fired. That could happen. But if you continuously live in fear that may happen, then you are taking an advance on that fear, on that anxiety, and as a result, you will live a very anxious life. How could you not? You're continuously expecting that terrible things may be happening, and they might happen, but there's also a pretty good probability that they will not happen at all. So one of Seneca's very important points is, so if you're going to be worried about something, then let it be something that you actually should be worried about. Right? Like, don't think, well, would have, should have, could have, maybe this and maybe that will happen, and maybe this, that, and the other. Yes, and maybe not. And I find that a very powerful circuit breaker. Okay, what am I experiencing now? But is this likely to happen? If I don't know, what's the point in me worrying about it now? Even if it may happen, right now it has not happened, so right now there's no cause for concern. And we forget about this a lot. We again, our brains are super complicated, right? We have many connections, not millions, not billions, trillions of connections between our brain cells. They allow us to compute amazing things. But the downside to that is that we see all the what ifs, and that can unnerve us very much. So I think that is a very important thing to always bear in mind. But is this real? Is it really likely to happen? And even if it is, right now it hasn't happened. So I think that matters. That ties into another, I'm just looking at my notes, another thing I wrote down, I don't think I have to spend much time on because I've kind of covered it, but another thing is it realistic? We continuously live, and again, some more than others, but we tend to really live in these what-if scenarios, worst-case scenarios. My granddad did this all the time. He always had these feelings of the worst possible thing would happen. I remember an example which I thought was it was kind of comical, but it's also kind of tragic at the same time. Where at some point he said he was calling a bank or something, and he wanted to complain about something, and he said, "Yeah, but you shouldn't complain too much, because then they put a little X beside your name, and then they will treat you worse in the future." And I mean, who would do that? Why would you think that's the way a bank works? But he believed that, and for the record, like, he was cognitively, that there was not a dementia or something. Like, he really believed that was the state of the world, that you sort of continuously assessed, and if you say the wrong things, then people will just put an X beside your name, and then you become some sort of outcast or something. I think many of us would say, well, that's kind of an unrealistic fear to have. Sometimes you have to call a bank and complain about something or ask about something or whatever, and that's kind of what that bank is for too. How well you'll be responded to, well, that's a different matter, but that's not really in your control, is it? So that is very interesting thinking. But then you are fearing all kinds of things that may not even be real. So again, ask yourself, this thing I fear, is it realistic? For the longest time as a child, I was afraid of wasps. And the reason I distinctly remember this, for the longest time I was afraid of wasps because I was walking through the garden, I was playing around as a kid, I closed my arm like this, and I actually trapped a wasp in my armpit, and of course it stung me. It was trapped, so it just bit me, or whatever it is a wasp does. And it was very painful because it was a wasp. And I was terrified of wasps, to the point that I would really freak out. If I even hear something buzz close to my head, I would have a reaction like that. And I distinctly remember this moment where I was sitting on a swing in the garden of the kid who lived across from us. And I'd been afraid of wasps for a long time, and I thought to myself, but this is weird and stupid. If you don't provoke that wasp, it shouldn't do anything to you, so it's probably fine. Just be calm. And now I'm fine. I mean, I don't go around petting wasps, which is probably a wise approach, but I no longer have that fear. And that was a relatively innocent fear, but I mean, I realized, young S.B.R.E. Brown realized sitting on the swing, this is not a realistic fear to have. So what's the point? Maybe I was a little stoic already. Anyway, so I think that's important. And the final thing I will say is, remember that primary stoic thing of some things are, other things are not within your control, because it matters. If it is something that is truly outside of your control, what's the point of being afraid of it? There's nothing you can do about it. You may not like it, you may not like the outcome, but there is actually nothing you can do. So fearing it is not going to make any difference. Try to accept it. And conversely, if it is within your control, well then control it. Then do something to make sure that the thing you fear will not happen, or is at least very unlikely to happen. After all, you are in control. You can control that thing. In both cases, it's not necessary to be afraid. Easier said than done. But at the end of the day, that is what you have. It is or it is not within your control, or at least it's partially within your control. Right? And then you do the best you can. So these are the thoughts I have. I think for me, that's the way of dealing with fear that works best. Again, I'm not talking about pathological fear. I'm not talking about exposure therapy or gradual exposure or flooding or these kinds of things, because that's really therapeutics. This is everyday things that we all experience. And that's what I would say. I hope this was useful. Let me know what you think about fear and how you deal with fear. That's always interesting to read also for others. And that's it. I'll gladly see you later. Probably back to Seneca. Bye.